Hello and welcome. My name is Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to draw a contrast between, on the one hand, Aristotelian science and, on the other hand, the modern science that we associate with the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Now, there is a lot to say about the distinction between these two ways of doing science. And of course, the Aristotelian tradition, starting with Aristotle in the 4th century BC and still alive in the 7th century AD, is a gigantic tradition that has many facets and many developments over those 2000 years. But I'm going to paint a very simple picture of some of its most essential elements so that we can see how radically our view of the world changes when we abandon Aristotelian science and adopt the modern science of the 17th century. So, the way that I want to do that is I want to go to Aristotle and I want to ask Aristotle, what are the fundamental things in nature? Right? If you look around you in the world, what are the words that you need to describe the contents of the universe? Well, Aristotle could say something like this. He could say, oh look, there are humans, there are sheep, there are cats, there are oak trees, and so on. Right? Those are the fundamental entities that we are surrounded with, interact with, and that we want to describe in a scientific picture of the world. So let's take one of them. Let's take humans. What could we say about humans? Well, I suppose we could say that humans have 2 arms and 2 legs, and they have 2 eyes. And with those eyes they can see, and with those legs they can walk, and with those arms they can learn to do all kinds of things. And they can talk and think and reason. All of that belongs to our idea, to our conception of a human being. Now let's call that idea or conception of a human being the form of a human being. And let's think a little bit about what this form is, how it functions in a description of the world. So let's take one of the most simple aspects of human beings. They have 2 legs. I mean, that seems right. But it's also the case that not all human beings have 2 legs. Right? Some human beings have no legs or only 1 leg, and some of them might have 3 legs or 4 legs. I mean, it's at least possible. So when we say that human beings have 2 legs, what we are saying, what we are putting down really, is a kind of standard. We're telling you what is normal for a human being, or what a human being ought to be like. And that's also the case with all these other things that we described, right? When we said that human beings had 2 eyes, well, not all human beings have 2 eyes. And that they can see with it, well, not all human beings can see. And not all human beings can talk. In fact, there's a large group of human beings who can't talk, very young children, and so on. So when we describe the universe, right, we have these fundamental kinds like humans and sheep and oak trees, and we describe their form, as we might call it, in this Aristotelian way of thinking. And in describing the form, we are laying down a kind of standard. We are pointing out what is normal for this type of entity, how this type of entity ought to be, how it ought to behave. And having put down that form, we can therefore understand the world in terms of, first of all, the standard and its deviations, and second, the standard and development towards it. So, if I meet somebody who has only 1 leg, that would be a deviation from the standard, right? It's not the normal thing. It's still a human being, this person, but, there's some way, like missing a leg, right? They miss a leg. That phrase already indicates that there's a standard of 2-leggedness and they miss 1 leg, right? They don't really fit the standard. So that would be a deviation. And the world is full of deviations, but if we want to understand what a human being is, we focus on the form, on the standard. Another type in which human beings, don't fully fulfill the standard is that they still have to develop towards it. Right? If a human being is born, if there's a baby, that baby doesn't have all the things that are part of the human form. Because although the baby might have 2 legs, they're not yet able to walk. And they're not yet able to talk. And they're not really able to think or be rational either. And so what is normal and proper for a human being is to develop from this early stage of infancy into a full-fledged adult who completely embodies the form. Right? And so that's what the world looks like. There are these basic kinds of entity, humans and sheep and oak trees, each of which have their form that they mostly embody, although there are always deviations, and in this world we see a constant process of development towards the full realization of the form. Right? Babies becoming adult human beings, lambs becoming sheep, tiny seedlings becoming oak trees. That's the shape of the world. So what happens when we move to the modern science of the 17th century? Well, if you take somebody like Descartes and you say, Descartes, look at this world around us, this natural world. What's the most basic entity that's there, right? How should we describe the contents of this universe? Then Descartes is going to tell you, well, matter. There's just matter. And matter is just particles of a certain size and shape moving around. That's it. That's the story. Of course, Descartes doesn't reject the idea that there are human beings and sheep and oak trees, but they're not fundamental. Right? If we really want to give a scientific description of the world, that's not where we ought to start. We ought to start by talking about these particles with their sizes and shapes and their movements. And when we talk about these particles with their sizes and shapes and their movements, then the next step, right, the really important, crucial thing that we need to do as scientists is we need to find out the laws. Because the laws of nature describe how the particles behave. And so these particles are moving around, they're bumping into each other. The laws of nature tell us how they move around and what happens when they bump into each other. But a law of nature is completely different from an Aristotelian form. Right? The Aristotelian form tells me that human beings, they walk and talk and think and run and they hunt for food or they grow food and so on. But not all of them do. Right? There are these deviations, these exceptions. Well, that's not how a law of nature works. There's no deviation from a law of nature. If we really have the law of nature, then it is exceptionless. It is true. It just describes what happens in the universe, what has to happen in the universe. Nothing can escape the law of nature. And if we see something that doesn't fit the law of nature, then either there is some other law, like doing something that we don't know about yet, or we are wrong about the law of nature and it's not really a law. If something is a law of nature, then it just describes what's there, right? It's not a standard. It doesn't tell us what is normal or proper or what something ought to be. It tells us what something is. There are no exceptions. It is the rule that the universe has to follow. That's a good way of thinking about it. So when we think about development and deviation, which are very important and very natural if we think in this Aristotelian way, they have no place in this new modern science. Right? There are no deviation. A human being with 3 legs or a human being with 1 leg is a mechanical system following the laws of nature. Right? There's nothing in the fundamental science itself that would allow us to say that one thing is normal or like proper and the other thing is abnormal, improper. Right? There's nothing in the fundamental science that allows us to say that. The whole category of a deviation from the standard isn't there. When we think of development, of course there's development. Right? Babies grow into adults and seedlings grow into oak trees. But we can't think about that in terms of a goal, like the form to which it is proper to develop. What we have to do when we describe a seedling growing into an oak tree is we have to find some mechanical process that works in the seedling and that slowly turns it into an oak tree. That's it, right? There must be some mechanism that's doing that. We can maybe find the mechanism, describe the mechanism, but we can't think of this kind of development as something becoming what it really is. Right? You can't look at a baby and see it grow into an adult human being and say, well, now it finally has become what it, in a sense, always already was, namely a human being. Right? You can't say that. It's just a mechanical process following the same laws as anything else. So we have two completely different world pictures here. Right? The Aristotelian world picture has sheep and men and oaks in it. And in fact, Aristotle believes that those species are eternal. Right? They have to be. If they're the fundamental building blocks of the universe, then they have to have been there from the beginning of time, and they have to remain there until the end of time. I mean, that's just what the universe consists of. And so there's all these forms, and they interact with each other in interesting ways, like man hold sheep, and sheep try to eat young oaks, and they lie in the shade of big oaks, and so on. So it's all interconnected. And we can look at the world as a continuous development of form and sometimes deviation from form. In the modern science that gets started in the 17th century, we think of the world as falling under exceptionless, mechanical, often mathematical laws that describe everything that happens, no exception. Where it makes no sense to think in terms of like deviations or standards, because there's no ought. There's just what happens. There's no what ought to happen in the natural world. And in which development has to be understood as a purely mechanical process on a par with everything else that happens in the universe. So, a completely different world picture with massive implications for how we think about our place in the world, the nature of human beings, the role of values in the world, and so on. Is Aristotelianism dead? Maybe not. Right? We can see, I think, a lot of Aristotelian ways of thinking as soon as we go outside of the natural sciences and think about our own lives, for instance. Or take something like psychiatry. Right? In psychiatry, we definitely have the idea of a norm and deviations from the norm, right? And you have to help people get back maybe to the norm if they're too far out of it, right? And so there seems to be some kind of idea of, well, there's a normal or proper way for human beings to work, and there are other ways which we need to do something about. I mean, that's a very powerful current of thought in psychiatry. When we think of ourselves, I think we think of ourselves as growing up in the sense of becoming who we, in a sense, already were, right? I mean, we were human beings, but we didn't fully live up to the idea of human beings when we were small, and as we grow older and we receive education and we learn wisdom and we experience the world, we are coming into our own. That's a very powerful way of thinking about ourselves. So, is Aristotelian science dead? Not really, but it's pretty much dead when we think about the natural sciences. And this leaves us with a pretty pickle or problem for philosophers to ponder, which is the problem of how to understand, on the one hand, this modern scientific worldview, and on the other hand, a view of human beings that doesn't seem to fully fit into it. And a lot of the philosophy of the past several centuries has been attempts to think that through.